The day that changed my life started out like any other. I came home after work, exhausted, only to find Kathy sitting at the kitchen table, her face tense. "Please, Ben, we need to talk," she began, her voice rushed and eyes avoiding mine. My stomach sank. I knew this conversation wasn't going to end well. She slid a manila envelope across the table. "I've already moved out, and I've filed for divorce," she continued, her words sounding rehearsed. I was too stunned to process it all at once. "Where are the kids?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're with me. But don't worry, you'll get plenty of visitation rights," she replied quickly. "I've met someone else, Ben. You know things between us haven't been right for a while. I'm truly sorry, but there's no easy way to say this." Anger flared in my chest. How could things ever be good when you were out screwing someone else? I shot back. For the first time, she actually looked guilty. "I'm really sorry," she repeated softly, her eyes finally meeting mine. "I have to think about what's best for the kids and me." "Who is he?" I demanded, my anger barely contained. "I'm not telling you his name. It would just cause more trouble," she said, clearly trying to keep control of the situation. "So, this guy screws me over, takes my wife and kids, and you think you can avoid trouble?" I spat. "Get real. If you're going to be like this, I'm leaving," she said, standing up and heading for the door. Her confession was a blow, but if I was honest with myself, it wasn't entirely unexpected. We hadn't been intimate for months, and our relationship had been on a downward spiral for almost a year. I'd suspected something was off and had tried to talk to Kathy repeatedly, but she always brushed me off, insisting I was just imagining things. Kathy had always been stunning, tall, striking, with a sense of style that turned heads. I should have been paying more attention to what was happening in our marriage instead of working 6 days a week trying to build a life for us. We used to play golf together at the municipal course, but Kathy always preferred the upscale country club she visited as a guest with her friends. It was a source of constant tension between us. I thought we should wait a few years before committing to an expensive membership, but Kathy wanted the high life now. Looking back, I couldn't shake the feeling that her new guy was either already a member or would be joining soon. There was a time I considered hiring a private investigator to keep an eye on her, but I never went through with it. Maybe I should have. But then again, what would it have changed? The moment she chose to be with someone else, our marriage was already dead. The next morning, I reached out to my business attorney, who put me in touch with a divorce specialist. I managed to secure an appointment quickly. The first thing I made clear was that my priority was my children. I needed to know where they were and how soon I could see them. Through Kathy's lawyer, we discovered that she and the kids were staying at a house owned by a man named Roger Brown. He was about a decade older than her, a well-known figure among the country club elite. Old money, the kind that bought luxury and status with ease. It was clear Kathy had traded me in for someone who could give her more. A bigger house, a thicker wallet, and that coveted club membership. My attorney didn't sugarcoat it when he delivered the harsh reality. Kathy, having been a stay-at-home mom, would almost certainly get custody of the kids. On top of that, she'd likely walk away with half the value of our home and possibly even a substantial portion of my business. That night was the lowest point of my life. I sat alone in a nearly empty house that no longer felt like mine. My children were sleeping under another man's roof, and my wife was in his bed. I had spent years sacrificing, working tirelessly to support my family, only to be discarded like yesterday's news. I tried to eat dinner, a microwaved meal, but discovered that Kathy had taken all the silverware with her. All I could find was a flimsy plastic fork in the back of a drawer. That pathetic fork, snapping under the weight of my frustration, was the final straw. As I stared down at my cold, untouched meal, something inside me hardened. I made a vow, a promise to myself that no matter what it took, no matter the cost, or who I had to confront, this would not stand. I would take back what was mine, and I would not let anyone, not Kathy, not her new man, not the system, strip me of everything I had worked so hard to build. I had been running my own equipment rental business ever since Kathy and I got married 8 years ago. Business was booming, but I wasn't pulling much cash out of it. Aside from a modest salary and the occasional bonus, nearly all the profits went right back into the business. I was focused on expanding, buying new equipment as fast as I could to grow our future. I'd explained to Kathy countless times that we needed to tighten our belts for a few years. Every dollar reinvested would pay off exponentially down the road. But Kathy wasn't interested in delayed gratification. She was all about the here and now. She loved her first-class flights and spa days at the club, while I focused on building something that would secure us for life. Despite everything, Kathy allowed me to see the kids. Nancy, 7, and Lucas, 5, stayed with me every other weekend, and I took them out for dinner at least once a week. It was far from what I wanted, but my attorney reminded me it was more than many fathers in my situation received. He gave me some invaluable advice. Don't get mad, get the house. It was his way of saying that, in divorce, strategy matters more than rage. Legally, Kathy had the upper hand as the stay-at-home mom, but morally, I was on higher ground. Running off with another man and taking the kids with her wasn't exactly a story that would sit well with our community. He urged me not to act on my anger. If I lashed out, I'd lose that moral high ground. Remember, he said, Kathy's probably already feeling guilty, and she's bound to be getting flack from friends, family, and even the kids. That's your leverage. Use it, don't squander it. I had to bite my tongue and swallow my pride, even though it felt like swallowing shards of glass. But I knew that, eventually, I'd find a way to turn the tables on her and her new man. My attorney was right. The fallout was intense. Friends and neighbors were shocked. Even Kathy's own parents disapproved of her actions. Her father called me one evening, asking if there was any hope of reconciliation. I had to tell him the hard truth. I wasn't the one who tore our family apart. That was Kathy's choice. Then, one evening, Kathy showed up at the house wanting to talk. But it wasn't really a conversation. It was her attempt to convince me that ending our marriage was somehow for the best, that we could amicably move on and everything would be fine. Kathy, just look around this place, I said, gesturing to the hollow, lifeless rooms. This isn't a home anymore. It's an empty shell. I don't have a wife anymore. I don't have my kids living here. This isn't a life. It's just 4 walls now. She started crying, her face crumbling as I laid it all out. But I couldn't hold back. You threw everything away, Kathy. For what? To cash in with your rich new boyfriend? Tears streaming down her face. She had no more words left. I stood up and opened the door. You should go, I told her quietly. And for the first time, she didn't have a retort. She just left, leaving me alone again in the house that once was a home. The kids were, unintentionally, a good source of information on Kathy's new improved life. But my best intel came from mutual friends. The way it worked was typical. Kathy would confide in a girlfriend, who would tell her husband, who would then pass it along to me. I was careful to keep up with my usual rounds of golf with friends, never asking direct questions, but simply listening. Everyone was eager to share the latest gossip. It seemed like our breakup had become the talk of the town for months. Through these conversations, I learned that Kathy hadn't initially gone looking to cheat. In fact, it was Roger Brown who had set his sights on her and patiently worked his way into her affections over time. The old scumsucker knew exactly what he was doing, courting her with the kind of lifestyle she always craved but I could never afford to give her. When Kathy's attorney offered a 60-40 split of our assets in her favor, my attorney recognized it for what it was, a bait for a quick settlement. But Kathy didn't need my money. She was already living in the lap of luxury with Brown, who had more wealth than they could ever burn through. So, we decided to hold our ground, seeing if we could get an even better deal. Then came the juicy tidbit from the grapevine. Kathy and Roger were planning a June wedding. The country club was already booked. This would be Roger's first marriage, so he was going all out, sparing no expense. Normally, there would have been plenty of time for Kathy to finalize our divorce and still make that June deadline. But my attorney had a few tricks up his sleeve and was confident he could drag things out just long enough to spoil their plans. He casually asked me if I had any upcoming business trips to Europe. I caught on quickly and told him I'd suddenly become very interested in a new line of generators being manufactured in Scotland. A little business investigation overseas could conveniently delay proceedings. Kathy's lawyer caught on to the stalling tactics fairly quickly and came back, asking bluntly what it would take to get a quick divorce. My first instinct was to demand that she walk away with nothing, but my attorney cautioned that such a hardline stance wouldn't look good in court. It's better to give her something reasonable, he advised, or we risk appearing vindictive. In the end, we offered her a deal. She'd get 50% of the value of our house, but only when it was sold or in 10 years, whichever came first. No upfront cash, no alimony, no child support, and absolutely no claim to my business, now or in the future. Kathy agreed to the terms without hesitation. I imagine the wedding invitations were already printed, and they didn't want anything delaying their big day. At my insistence, the agreement explicitly stated that this was a final deal, with no loopholes for her to come back later for more. I wanted it crystal clear. Once it was over, it was truly over. She was ready to move on with her new, shiny life, and I was more than happy to let her. After Kathy moved out, I shifted my focus when it came to the business. I stopped making large equipment purchases, keeping only what was essential and putting everything else on credit. My priority was to accumulate cash, funneling every spare dollar into savings. Once the divorce was finalized in February, plenty of time before Kathy's June wedding, I felt a weight lift. It was like a race to the finish line. But now, I was free to start my life over on my own terms. The first thing I did was house hunting. I wanted a place where the kids could feel at home, something new that was just ours. I eventually found the perfect spot, a spacious 5-bedroom house with a pool, a huge yard backing onto the woods, and an in-law apartment above the garage. I knew the kids would love it. I took a substantial bonus from my business and paid cash for the property. As for the old house, instead of selling it and coughing up Kathy's 50% share, I decided to rent it out. This way, she wouldn't see a dime until the 10 years were up, just like we had agreed. The look on Kathy's face when she came to pick up the kids from the new house was priceless. The kids were bubbling over with excitement, giving her the grand tour. She was clearly stunned. "How can you afford a house like this, Ben?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I always told you the business would pay off someday," I replied with a grin. "Did you think I was kidding?" "But the mortgage, it must be enormous," she stammered. "I paid cash, Kathy. You should have paid more attention to what I was building. The rental inventory alone is worth over $5 million. I added casually, watching her face shift from confusion to something like regret. "Ben, I had no idea." "Really?" She looked genuinely taken aback, perhaps even realizing that she'd bet on the wrong horse. But it was too late for her now. I had moved on. To complete my transformation, I joined the same country club Kathy had been so eager to join with Brown. The first time I walked into the bar and saw them there together was a test of my nerves, but I held it together. Kathy couldn't stop glancing my way, her eyes filled with something that almost looked like longing. Maybe she was realizing that the grass wasn't greener after all. But as much as I enjoyed my quiet revenge, the bitterness lingered. Watching them flaunt their relationship was like rubbing salt into an open wound. That's when I decided to reach out to an old customer of mine, Al. He rented equipment from me regularly, generators, temporary HVAC units. But I also knew he was connected. People in the business circles whispered about his influence, the kind that could arrange for problems to go away. I had a very discreet conversation with Al one evening. I made it clear what I wanted. For Roger Brown to have a very unfortunate accident, I stressed that it needed to look completely natural. Al listened, nodding slowly, and then he told me the truth. It would cost more to make it look like an accident. He could either connect me directly with the right people or handle everything himself for a fee, about 1/3 of the total cost. I liked the idea of keeping my identity a secret, with Al as the sole contact. It was worth the extra money to ensure no one could trace it back to me. A week later, Al came back with a price: 75 boxes of ZD, which was our code for $75,000. I agreed and reminded him it had to be done before the wedding in June. As the weeks dragged on and the wedding date approached, I started to get nervous. There were no updates, no confirmation that anything was in motion. I wondered if Al had backed out, or if he was stringing me along. Then, less than a week before the big day, I got the news. Roger Brown was found dead in a seedy motel just outside of town. No one knew what he was doing there. The story that made the rounds was that he'd overdosed on some recreational substances, though whispers hinted at a heart attack. The official narrative didn't matter much to me. All I cared about was that the job was done, and done without a trace. Kathy's June wedding was canceled, of course. There were no grand celebrations, no happily ever after for her with Roger. All that was left for her was to pick up the pieces of her life once again. As for me, I felt a dark satisfaction. I had lost nearly everything, but I had clawed back some measure of control over my fate. Kathy had played her cards, and I'd played mine. In the end, I had the house, the kids on weekends, my business thriving, and the quiet knowledge that Roger Brown was no longer a problem. I may not have won the moral high ground my attorney had talked about, but in this game, I had taken back something more important: my power. As the details of Roger Brown last night trickled out, it was almost comical how cliché the whole thing had turned out. Apparently, his bachelor party was just as debaucherous as you'd expect for a guy like him. Drinks, strippers, and drugs. It was the predictable send-off for a man living the high life. Toward the end of the night, two stunning women appeared to whisk Roger away, right in front of his party guests. They probably assumed these women were hired to give the groom a final night to remember, but it was the motel incident that sealed the deal. According to what I heard, Roger, high on booze and who knows what, started snorting lines. Only, In his state, he couldn't tell the difference between two different narcotics. I couldn't help but think of that scene in Pulp Fiction. Uma Thurman, her nose full of drug, nearly ODing because she mistook it for coke. But unlike the movie, there was no John Travolta to jab a shot of adrenaline into Roger's heart. That was the end of Mr. Brown, right there in that dingy motel room. Did I feel bad? Not for a second. If anything, I felt a dark satisfaction. After all, this was the man who had stolen my family, who had taken Kathy and my kids, leaving me to pick up the pieces. The thought of Brown being around for the next 20 years, pretending to be my children's father, made me sick. I had this vision stuck in my head, of him walking Nancy down the aisle at her wedding someday, playing the proud stepfather while I sat at the back of the church, the discarded real father. Now, that nightmare was never going to happen. That $75,000? Worth every penny. The cops and detectives who looked into Roger's death decided there was no foul play involved. No one ever found those two mysterious women, nor figured out who had hired them. As far as they could tell, it was just another wealthy idiot who partied a little too hard. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. No wedding, no happily ever after for Kathy. It was almost poetic. A couple of days after his funeral, I made my own pilgrimage to Roger's grave. I brought along a cheap plastic fork I had saved for the occasion. I jabbed it into the soil with a sense of finality. It was my silent way of saying, stick a fork in him. He's done. Petty, sure, but it felt good. The kind of small, private victory that I could savor. Kathy, on the other hand, was left in shambles. All her plans had crumbled overnight. She went from planning the wedding of the century to dealing with debt collectors. 3 months after Roger's funeral, the hammer really came down. A lawyer showed up at her door on behalf of the Brown family, politely informing her that she needed to vacate Roger's house. She wasn't in the will, she wasn't his wife, and now she had no legal claim to his estate. To make matters worse, Kathy had racked up debt, planning a lavish wedding she would never have. All those expenses were on credit cards in her own name. Now, with no income and no rich fiancé to fall back on, she was scrambling. Naturally, Kathy's first instinct was to drag me back into court, hoping to squeeze out some emergency adjustment to our divorce settlement. Her sob story didn't get her far. The judge took one look at her pleas and told her she needed to get a job. He reminded her that she had agreed to the original divorce terms just a few months prior, and the final deal clause was clear. She couldn't come back asking for more. The death of her rich fiancé wasn't my problem. During those court proceedings, one of Kathy's attorneys kept giving me this look, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind, wondering about the suspicious timing of Roger's death, just after our divorce was finalized but right before the wedding. The worst timing imaginable for Kathy, but the best for me. Let him wonder. I wasn't going to lose any sleep over it. The way I saw it, the universe had finally thrown me a bone after all I'd lost. And if someone suspected that I might have had a hand in the misfortune that befell Roger Brown, well, they'd find it awfully hard to prove. When Kathy's world came crashing down, it was the perfect moment for my attorney to strike. He saw the opportunity and went straight for it, arguing that since Kathy was now practically homeless, the children would be far better off living with me. Kathy's parents were squeezed into a one-bedroom condo. They couldn't take in 2 kids, not comfortably, anyway. And with Kathy's financial situation in freefall, there was no way she could provide for them like she used to. The fact that Kathy had been granted sole physical custody during our divorce had initially been a tough pill to swallow. But now, with her dream life in shambles, that arrangement was no longer viable. My attorney laid it out clearly. I had a stable, spacious home with more than enough room for the kids. I could hire a live-in housekeeper or nanny to ensure they had the support they needed, whereas Kathy was struggling just to keep her head above water. And to sweeten the deal, my attorney emphasized that, given her dire financial state, I wouldn't ask for any child support if custody was transferred to me. In the end, the judge agreed with our proposal. The kids would be better off with me, where they had stability, space, and resources. The decision was like a hammer blow to Kathy, but her tears didn't move me. As we stood outside the courtroom, making arrangements for the kids to move in with me the very next day, I could see the despair in her eyes. But after everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. When she broke down, pleading with me to reconsider, all I could think about was how indifferent she had been when she walked away from our life together for her shiny, new one with Brown. She'd thought the grass was greener, but it turned out to be nothing but weeds. The next day, I brought the kids to their new home, a place that was truly theirs now. They settled in quickly, thrilled with their new rooms, the big backyard, and the pool. I made sure they felt welcome and at ease, keeping their lives as stable as possible. I could tell they were a bit confused about why they were suddenly moving, but I reassured them that everything would be okay. And it would be. For me, it felt like finally, after all the pain and betrayal, the universe had given me a chance to set things right. With the court's decision made, it didn't take long for Kathy's life to unravel completely. The moment she was forced to hand over the kids, the last thread of stability she was clinging to snapped. In the span of just a few months, she went from planning her dream wedding with Brown to standing in an empty apartment with no job, no partner, and no place to call home. The Brown family's lawyers made it clear. She had no legal right to stay in the house Roger had bought. Within days of the funeral, she was given a deadline to vacate the property. She tried to hold on, scrambling to figure something out, but her attorney's appeal for financial assistance from me was swiftly shot down in court. The final deal clause in our divorce settlement was ironclad, and the judge wasn't about to bend the rules just because Kathy's golden parachute had failed to deploy. In the end, she had no choice but to pack up what little she had left. With her credit cards maxed out from the wedding expenses she'd racked up in anticipation of becoming Mrs. Brown, she couldn't even afford to rent a decent apartment. Kathy was forced to leave town, hoping to find a fresh start somewhere far away, where people wouldn't recognize her as the woman who lost everything overnight. I heard through the grapevine that she'd been couch surfing with old friends in other cities, desperately applying for jobs to get back on her feet. But it wasn't easy for her. She hadn't worked a real job in years, and her resume was a patchwork of sporadic part-time gigs she'd taken on more as hobbies than anything else. Employers were wary, and her once charmed life of socializing at the country club and managing charity events didn't exactly translate into a steady paycheck. As I settled into my new life with the kids, I would occasionally hear rumors trickle back through friends who were still in touch with her. The last I heard, she was living in a rundown apartment somewhere out of state, taking whatever temporary work she could find just to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, my kids were thriving. They had the stability, the space, and the support they needed, and I was finally able to give them the home they deserved. And as for Kathy, she was just a ghost from the past, left to wander through the ruins of a life she thought was going to be perfect. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.